It's been uncovered that Ukraine is now buying Russian diesel with U.S. dollars. How fascinating. The U.S. is once again funding both sides of a war. Let's jump in and see the Seymour Hersh article and what it has for us. We've got a CATO Institute article as well as something from The Guardian. Let's go. Amid rampant corruption in Kiev, U.S. troops gather at the Ukrainian border. What does the Biden administration want to do, and does it have an endgame? I'd argue nothing good for the Ukrainian people, seeing as they're willing to just grind them into the dirt. It doesn't matter how many Ukrainians die, as long as Russia gets bled dry. It doesn't matter how much money that the people in Eastern Europe have to pay for their natural gas in places like Germany, because they're at the behest of Russia because of what was the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So now they're completely fucked. The Ukrainian government, headed by Volodymyr Zelensky, has been using American taxpayer funds to pay dearly for the vitally needed diesel fuel that is keeping the Ukrainian army on the move in its war with Russia. It is unknown how much of the Zelensky government is paying per gallon of fuel, but the Pentagon was paying $400 per gallon to transport gasoline from a port in Pakistan via truck or parachute into Afghanistan during their decades-long war. What is also known is that Zelensky has been buying fuel from Russia, of which it and Washington are currently at war, and the Ukrainian president and many in his entourage have been skimming untold millions from American dollars earmarked for diesel fuel payments. One estimate by analysts from the Central Intelligence Agency put the embezzled funds at nearly $400 million last year. At least another expert compared the level of corruption in Kiev as approaching that of the Afghan war, although there will be no professional audit reports emerging from Ukraine. Won't Congress be ever so happy? Zelensky has been buying discount diesel from the Russians, one knowledgeable American intelligence official told me. And who's paying for that gas and oil? We are. Putin and his oligarchs are making millions on it. So as your dollar is being completely destroyed through inflation because they want to print so much money and send it to Ukraine, and they want to print so much money so they can satiate people through the lockdowns, what you have now is record high inflation. You have an unrealistic standard that we are trying to achieve for this war for the Ukrainian people, and saying that no, Russia cannot take an inch of this land. Many government ministries in Kiev have been literally competing, as I was told, to set up front companies for export contracts for weapons and ammunition with private arms dealers around the world, all of which provide kickbacks. Many of those companies are in Poland and Chechnya, but others are thought to exist in the Persian Gulf and Israel. I wouldn't be surprised to learn that there are others in places like the Cayman Islands and Panama, and there are a lot of Americans involved, an American expert on international trade had told me. The issue of corruption was directly raised with Zelensky in a meeting last January in Kiev with the CIA Director William Burns. His message to the Ukrainian president, I was told by an intelligence official with direct knowledge of the meeting, was out of a 1950s mob movie. The senior generals and government officials in Kiev were angry at what Zelensky's greed had turned out. So Burns told the Ukrainian president because he was taking a larger share of the skim money than was going to the generals. So it's not that, oh, you shouldn't be taking this money in general. It's, well, you're taking more than was put in your pot, sir. Burns also presented Zelensky with a list of 35 generals and senior officials whose corruption was known to the CIA and others in the American government. Zelensky responded to the American pressure 10 days later by publicly dismissing 10 of the most ostentatious officials on the list and doing little else. The 10 he got rid of were brazenly bragging about the money they had, driving around Kiev in their new Mercedes, the intelligence official had told me. This article from Seymour Hersh is capped off because of the paywall. I have not paid. I need to do this. Nonetheless, we're going to move on and see what's going on in this CATO Institute article as well as this Guardian article. And yeah, let's go ahead and jump right into this. Whitewashing Ukraine's corruption. The country is not a symbol of freedom and liberal democracy as the world has been told. Got that right, CATO. Statements from U.S. and other Western officials, as well as pervasive accounts in the news media, have created a stunningly misleading image of Ukraine. There's been a conceited effort to portray the country not only as a victim of brutal Russian aggression, but as a plucky and noble bulwark of freedom and democracy. The conventional narrative would have us believe that Ukraine is an Eastern European version of Denmark. I don't remember Denmark getting articles written about it by people like The Guardian saying, "Welcome to Ukraine, the most corrupt nation in Europe." The promoters of that narrative contend that the ongoing war is not just a quarrel between Russia and Ukraine over Kiev's ambitions to join NATO and Moscow's territorial claims in Crimea and the Donbass. No. They insist the war is a part of the global struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, and that the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is a leader worthy of nothing less than Winston Churchill's legacy. What a disgrace to Winston Churchill. President Biden in his March 26 remarks on the war said the conflict was a battle between democracy and autocracy, between liberty and repression, between rules-based order and one governed by brute force. Ironic. CNN's John Blake literally compared Ukraine's cause to the Americans in its Revolutionary War. He claimed Ukrainians are building their own monuments to democracy with their blood. And then Zelensky is banning the opposition party so that sacrifice to their democracy and their blood is basically for nothing. The world, he said, has been transfixed by their battle to repel the mighty Russian army and preserve the birth of democracy in their homeland. He added that the war and everything else that's going on in Ukraine has been transfixed. And the war in Ukraine isn't just a geopolitical struggle, it is a call to remember that the courage of the Ukrainian people is a reminder of what the U.S. used to be, a beacon of liberty, where virtually every schoolchild memorized the Concordian hymn poem inscribed at the base of the Minuteman statue. This country is not a symbol of freedom and liberal democracy. In March 26, USA Today op-ed, John M. Bridgeland, director of the White House Domestic Policy Council under President George W. Bush, similarly expressed fawning admiration for Zelensky and Ukraine's alleged commitment to democracy. The world has seen the bravery of Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky and the Ukrainian people, who are willing to die to defend their democracy and freedom, he wrote. Indeed, Bridgeland said, no cost is too high for Ukrainians to defend their democracy and beloved Ukraine. I don't know, man. Like, your sister dies, your brother dies, your father goes off and gets irreparably destroyed through war, your mother is completely rocked from the fact that your family has been shell-shocked and destroyed, and now you're a migrant in a country you don't know. Seems like a lot. Seems like a lot to pay. Seems like a pretty high cost. Fox News contributor and former CIA station chief Dan Hoffman contended that what scares Vladimir Putin at the heart of the conflict is democracy. It's not NATO's representation of a threat. It's not the encroachment of NATO expanding towards Russia and approaching their border and acquiring what once were satellite states along their border and putting them in NATO. No. It's because they fear democracy. Fox News contributor and former CIA station chief Dan Hoffman contended that what scares Putin is democracy. I despise this mentality that democracy is so great that it would be feared. If it was so fantastic, why is it that you would be in total opposition to the structural norm of what is being pushed? The notion that Ukraine was such an appealing democratic model in Eastern Europe that the country's mere existence terrified Putin may be comforting myth to the U.S. politicians and pundits, but it is a myth. Ukraine is far from being a democratic capitalist model and an irresistible magnet for Russia's groaning masses. The reality is murkier and troubling. Ukraine has been one of long and more corrupt countries in the international system than most. In its annual report published in January 2022, Transparency International ranked Ukraine 123rd of 180 countries it examined, with a score of 32 on a 100-point scale. By comparison, notoriously corrupt Russia ranked just modestly lower 139th with a score of 29. Ukraine's track record of protecting democracy and civil liberties is not much better than its performance on corruption. In the Freedom House 2022 report, Ukraine is listed in the partly free category with a score of about 61 out of possible 100. Other countries in that category include such bastions of liberal democracy as Rodrigo Duterte's Philippines at 55, Serbia at 62, Hungary at 59, and Singapore at 47. Interestingly, Hungary, which has been a target of vitriolic criticism from progressives in the West because of Prime Minister Viktor Orban's conservative social policy, ranks 8 points higher than Ukraine, which is the recipient of uncritical praise from the same Western ideological factions. Even before the war erupted, the ugly examples of authoritarianism in Ukraine's political governance just months after the 2014 Maidan revolution, there were efforts to smother domestic critics, which accelerated as years passed. Ukrainian officials also harassed political dissidents, adopted censorship measures, and barred foreign journalists from whom they regarded as critics of the Ukrainian government and policies. Nothing says defending democracy like getting rid of your opposition. So offensive actions were criticized by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and other independent observers. The neo-Nazi Azov Battalion was an integral part of President Petro Poroshenko's military and security apparatus, and has remained during that role and stays there during Zelensky's reign. Indeed, some repressive measures deepened under Zelensky even before the outbreak of the war. In February 2021, Ukraine's government closed several, mostly but not entirely pro-Russian independent media outlets. They did so on the basis of utterly vague, open-ended standards. Zelensky has now used the war as justification for outlawing 11 opposition parties and nationalizing several media outlets. Those are hardly appropriate measures in a democracy, even in wartime. It is entirely appropriate to sympathize with Ukrainians who are experiencing terrible suffering as a result of Vladimir Putin's decisions to launch a war. Whatever the level of provocations from the United States and its NATO allies, the Ukrainians' willingness to collaborate in those provocations, Russia's response was over the top. It created a dangerous breach of the peace in Europe, and the humanitarian catastrophe that followed was absolutely horrific. However, one can condemn Putin's actions and even cheer on Ukraine's military resistance without fostering a false image of Ukraine's political system. The country is not a symbol of freedom and liberal democracy. The war is not an existential struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. At best, Ukraine is a corrupt, quasi-democratic entity with troubling repressive policies. Given that sobering reality, calls for America to stand with Ukraine are misplaced. Preserving Ukraine's independence and territorial integrity most certainly are not worth the United States risking war with armed Russia. And I fully agree, as I stated before in my prior video, I would sooner rather not see future generations have their entire livelihood demolished, as well as the current one, over a small patch of land with ethnically speaking Russians that grows wheat. It is the most mentally insane idea I have ever seen in my entire life, that we would be willing to glass the entire continent over the notion of a satellite state. Let's move on, see what The Guardian has. It talks about some truly sad stuff about the corruption within Ukraine's medical system. I don't think I'll get through the entire article, but there is some stuff I want to touch on that's like about halfway through it, because it is very important to talk about the notion of what the good people in these countries do to fight the corruption at all turns, even at the behest of their own salary, at the behest of their own goodwill, and their own capacity to live a more free life. Let's see what we have. Welcome to Ukraine, the most corrupt nation in Europe. Would never see an article written like this in the corporate press today. They would catch too much slack and be ostracized from the groupthink. While the conflict in Russia heats up in the east, life for most Ukrainians is marred by corruption so endemic that even hospitals appear to be infected. Can anyone clean the country up? So this whole thing, it says, while the conflict with Russia heats up in the east. This is in 2015, and you will consistently see people in the legacy media nonstop usher the narrative, well, this is a completely unprovoked action by Vladimir Putin. You just don't understand. It's like, no, the historical context says that this is provoked. It doesn't mean he's justified. Ukraine's National Cancer Institute occupies 3 smoke gray 6-story blocks in a residential district on the edge of Kiev. The external walls are tiled with occasional scars where the bricks peep through. When Soviet workmen completed the facade, they built the date into the side. 1968. Since then, maintenance appears to have been erratic. Nonetheless, business at the Institute has always been brisk and is getting brisker. Half of Ukraine's men and a fifth of its women smoke. The international diet is heavy with animal fat, and the national drink is vodka. You're not helping the West with understanding stereotypes. Radiation from the Chernobyl disaster spread thyroid cancers throughout the 1980s generation, increasing the incidence among children tenfold. There are few family doctors, which means the breast, prostate, and bowel tumors often go undetected for months. Survival rates of these cancers are among the lowest in Europe. God, that's tragic. In 2008, Professor Dr. Mann, because I don't know how to pronounce that except for Igor, experienced Ukrainian-born surgeon predicted in a magazine interview that the number of new diagnoses for cancer would continue to rise from 165,000 annually to around 200,000 by 2020. That year, President Viktor Yanukovych picked Dr. Mann as Ukraine's champion in a new war on cancer. Dr. Mann took charge of the Cancer Institute, which is both the country's leading cancer hospital and its premier research institution, and was granted extensive powers to mend Ukraine's health, including a budget independent of the health ministry, so that he could buy his own medicines and equipment. In Britain, he would be known as the Cancer Czar. In Ukraine, he was the chief oncologist. And he has been effective at all of his duties, according to the Institute's own assessment. Under the leadership of Professor Dr. Mann, new approaches, conceptions, and technology have been introduced, new principles for treating cancer patients, a significant proportion for whom have been returned to a fully active life. That's wonderful. The Institute said in a summary of its work published in April. The Cancer Institute, though no more modern inside than out, feels reassuring. Surgeons in white coats discuss cases as they walk to operating theaters. Nurses bustle around, bearing armfuls of folders. In the corridors, patients sit on their folding cinema-style seats, talking on their phones, while the relatives try to catch the doctor's attention. Old women dressed in green scrubs mop the floors with disinfectant, giving the building a chemical tang that clings to your clothes long after you leave. Anyone that's been in what we'll call the terminal ward of a hospital that has smelled this, and it is absolutely brutal. It just stings inside of your nose. Even when you walk out, you smell it on yourself. It's horrible. It feels like a place where patients can come knowing that the goal is to get them well again. But these surgeons here are working here that are former health minister, patients, and anti-corruption activists all claim that this is not the whole story. They claim that, like the hospital, the government bodies all over Ukraine appear to be infected by corruption. And despite widespread public anger at the nation's corruption problem, which has provoked 2 revolutions in a decade, no one appears to be able to be willing to do anything about it. Presumably there is money, said Konstantin Sidorenko, a consultant and anesthesiast at the Institute, when we first met in July, but for some reason the money doesn't reach the most important places like intensive care, so it means we have to earn everything ourselves. The phrase earn everything ourselves, he explained, is a euphemism for taking bribes. Through Sidorenko was quickly to point out that this wasn't something he wanted to do. He led the team of doctors running intensive care, so he was responsible for the Institute's most vulnerable patients. Clinically, he felt he had no choice but to take the money. We were on the 6th floor sitting in his office, which was about the size of a typical bathroom. Sidorenko, who had graying, wavy hair and a friendly open face, reached into the pocket of his white coat and took out a small cubic box. It contained an oxygen sensor for a respirator, the machines that provide air for the patients unable to breathe for themselves. Each sensor costs around 4,000, whatever this currency is, currently 164 euros. And each of his 10 respirators needs to be a replacement sensor at least once a year. That's 40,000 of their currency, which is 1,600 euros in total. And this is in total a tiny part of the money he needs to keep all of his machines working properly, which exceeds over 28,000 euros annually. For the last 2 years, he claimed the Institute had not provided him with sufficient money for maintenance despite his repeated requests at clinical meetings. I have equipment worth millions, I need to service it or it will break and my patients will die. Where do I get the money? In other words, he had a very strong dilemma. Be an honest and bad doctor or take bribes and be a good doctor. It is humiliating, but there is only one answer. My doctors understand, and the patients pay, Sidorenko said. Behind my chair was a tall settle, the kind found in former Soviet flats from Kiev to Kamchatka. The top half was a display cabinet full of medical books and files. Below that was a cupboard. Sidorenko squeezed past me to open the door and brought out a stack of envelopes so tall it required both hands to steady it. Some of them were half an inch thick, and all of them were filled with banknotes. He explained that almost all of his doctors collect the money from patients and then pass it on to him. He uses it to maintain the machines that keep his patients alive. These are the realities of being a doctor in Ukraine, he said. He was better qualified than most to assess the situation since he sat on the commission that chose the equipment that institutes should buy. He said he had seen how hospitals had systemically overpaid for the equipment and bought allegedly a respirator for 130,000 euros more than it was worth. That 130,000 euros would have supplied respirators with sensors for 40 years. Sidorenko had only one explanation for why the hospital would overpay for equipment. Some managers were engaged in secret deals with the suppliers to defraud the state budget, and then dividing up with extra money among themselves. Essentially, Sidorenko's patients, via their kickbacks, were making up for the shortfall. Shaputin, who is Dr. Man, the head of the Institute, refused to comment on the specific allegations made by Sidorenko. That such practices were taking place at this institute. Sidorenko had another reason to be frustrated, as he had only 23 years of experience, but earned only $300 a month, and by $300 we mean 300 euros. Barely enough to feed his 4 young children, let alone pay the numerous small bribes to teachers, traffic police, plumbers, tax officers that are part of everyday life in Ukraine. And this is something many people in the West can't even fathom, the idea that we have to pay our doctors, not so that they can take care of us, because obviously that's clear, but, I mean, there's also an obligation, like you show up to a hospital and they have to, take care of you. It's kind of insane when it comes to our healthcare system, realistically, but that's a conversation for a different day. But this notion that you have 300 euros a month to take care of your own family, and what you're going to do is you're going to siphon away your own funds so you can take care of the machines within the hospital, because even if the money runs out from the patients, you know that they still need to be taken care of and you're willing to do it. That's the beauty of good nurses and good doctors, but it's also the beauty of living in a place, like I said, in the West, where we are so far removed from the context of corruption to this scale. Don't get me wrong, we have the corruption of people like Nancy Pelosi and all these other people in Congress and in the Senate and all these other forms of government that are sitting there getting kickbacks. They're either backing lobbyists, and that's all they do because they don't back the people that they voted them in. So nonetheless, we push on, and what we see is the rest of this article goes into more detail. It talks about the Maidan coup in 2014. It talks about other things when it comes to Yanukovych fleeing and where he went and how he did it. But that's really all I'm going to cover. I just wish that people would understand the weight behind what they were dealing with in these situations, because it's absolutely unfathomable.